Thanks for coming out tonight. This seems to be my summer to close. Last Wednesday, I was in Little Rock doing the final session of the summer series for the Pleasant Valley Church of Christ, and here I am doing the last one for you guys. So I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know if that says something good about me or bad about me, but I'm the closer. So you can be grateful for that. I'm really glad to be here. I really appreciate this church. I've known of you for several years and know you to be a healthy, active, serving church, and I'm really grateful for that. And this seems to be a very exciting time in the life of the church with Tim being here now for 2 months, and Jake being here for how long? How long have you been here? 3 months. And then Josh moving into a new position here. So just a lot of exciting things going on, and I'm really grateful for that as well. Change is good for a church, and new beginnings are good for churches. So this is a really exciting time for you guys. How many of you have a mobile phone? Okay, so most everybody. If you don't have an iPhone, would you raise your phone up? If you don't have an iPhone, raise your phone. Who does not have an iPhone? All right. So of the non-iPhone people, what are you holding up? What is your phone? What is it? Android. NV2. Is that like from the 19th century or? Must be a Cincinnati thing. Are they all Androids? Does yours use Android system, or is it's totally different? What is yours?
I have no idea.
You have no idea? Somebody back there had a non-iPhone. Okay, what is that?
It's an LG. It's also semi-smart.
Okay, LG. Yeah, and I think that's Android. So we have maybe 10 Android / other kinds of things. Everybody else that has a mobile phone, is it an iPhone? Raise up your iPhone. Okay. Why do you like the iPhone? Those of you who are iPhone users. It's simple. It's friendly. Your son-in-law works for them, so that's great, huh? But you probably don't get any kind of discount. Apple discounts 0. Oh, they do? Can you text us his name? Okay, it's friendly. It's cheaper. Oh, what else? What else do you like about the iPhone? It was given to you. That's always nice. And free. What is the deal here? It's cheap. It's free. It was given to you. I'll give you my address, and if you happen to have a free iPhone 6, just send it to me. Those of you who are not iPhone users, what do you like about your phone? You don't leave it on. Thank you for that. We're grateful for that. What do you like about your non-iPhone? $100 a year for the data for the plan and everything. Well, that's a pretty good deal. Yeah. So cost plays a factor. Although we've got free iPhones going around here. Just ask anybody; they'll give one to you for free. All right. Has anybody ever switched from a non-iPhone to an iPhone in here? You made the switch. You made the switch. Okay. Was that hard or easy? What was that like? It was pretty easy because the iPhone's easy to use and friendly. Yeah. Helps to have a friendly phone. They are friendly phones. This year, let's see if there we go. Fantastic. I do have an iPhone and I have an iPad, but for all of my life that we've had computers, I've been a PC user, Windows and a PC. How many people still use a PC? Good old-fashioned. All right, the faithful. This was the year that I decided to make the transition to Apple computer, a MacBook Pro. I have a coworker whose MacBook Pro needed to be upgraded, and so it was being passed down the line to somebody, and I thought, well, this is my opportunity. Here's a used MacBook Pro, so I'm going to see if I can finally make the jump here. Anybody in here ever made the jump from PC to Mac? A few of us have. Okay. Well, for someone like me, now for someone like you, maybe not, but for someone like me, there was a huge learning curve in going from PC to MacBook, because there are a lot of things that are done differently between the hardware is different and the software is different. And it really slowed down my work production for quite a while till I kind of got the hang of things. Of course, there are some things that are very similar between a PC and an Apple computer. They both use keyboards. Some of the software runs the same. Some of the commands are the same. You can do similar things with both those computers. So for a while, as I transitioned and I was working on this MacBook Pro, I was just doing it all on my own, just trying to learn it all on my own. And I could look up things online. I could go to the Apple website, the support area there, and try to find some help. And I figured out quite a bit on my own and finally got going, started writing sermons again, which was useful for the church and for my income. But eventually, I realized that I really needed to get with some other folks here. And most of our staff uses Macs. And so I sat down with some of them. I'll just call them power users. These are people that have used a Mac for a long time, and they just know a lot about them. And I sat down with them, and I said, okay, I know how to do this on a PC, but how do you do that on a Mac? Or, what is this button right here on the Mac? What does that do? Am I supposed to press that or not? And here's what I want to do, but I can't figure out how to do that on the Mac. And so as I talked to power users, I learned that, oh my goodness, there's so many things I could do that I am not doing with this MacBook Pro. And so suddenly it became a very useful resource, and I was able to do some things that I never even imagined that I could do with it. And maybe you've experienced something like that in some other area of your life. There are certain skills, like basketball, that you can pick up on your own. You can pick up a basketball, you can teach yourself to dribble it, you can teach yourself to shoot it. There are other behaviors, other practices that are like that you can pick it up pretty much on your own. Driving is probably not one of those for most of us. I wish that I only learned about this video yesterday. I wish I had learned of it sooner, because I would have brought it. We've got a wonderful family at Highland. I won't mention their name just in case it gets back to them, because they're still processing this. But the oldest daughter decided to teach ninth grade daughter how to drive. So they go to the church parking lot, and we have these security video cameras around the outside of the building, so they capture everything. So we have this beautiful video of these two girls and the ninth graders in the driver's seat taking off, and they're going along just fine down the pavement in the church parking lot, and there's a tree way over here, and they're going this way. They're going just perfectly, and then the car goes right into the tree. I mean, it's like you would have had to plan to get that car to turn and hit that tree. So maybe driving is not one of those skills that you just pick up on your own. A lot of skills, however, you can kind of pick up on your own. You can learn to do some things. But eventually, you kind of need to sit down with a power user. If you're talking about basketball, it'd be helpful to have a coach come along and say, well, there's actually a better way to shoot. There's some tips here for dribbling. Let me teach that to you. Prayer is similar to that. On the one hand, prayer is very simple, isn't it? There are a lot of things that any person can pick up entirely on their own in order to pray. Because prayer at its basic is just a person talking to God and sharing with God what is on your heart and what's going on in life. Peter Kreeft is an author. He writes a lot about prayer. He says, prayer is easier than we think. We can all do it, even the most sinful, shallow, silly, and stupid of us. You do not have to master some mystical method. You do not have to master a method at all. Can you talk to a friend? Then you can talk to God, for He is your friend. And that is what prayer is. The single most important piece of advice about prayer is one word: begin. I think that is so important for us to remember. I have a good friend at Highland. She's a widow. We meet regularly, talk about spiritual things. And one of the things that she most often says is, I wish I knew how to pray. Or when she hears someone pray out loud like we did just a few moments ago, I wish I could pray like he prays. I wish my prayers sounded like her prayers. And I tell her the same thing every time. Do you know the best way to pray? The best way to pray is the way that you pray. Because what God's interested in is your heart. He doesn't care what kind of words you use, whether you're standing or sitting. What God wants to hear from you is your heart. So the best way to pray is the way that you pray, not how someone else prays. So on the one hand, prayer is very simple. You don't have to learn some mystical method. You don't have to learn any method at all. On the other hand, there are some people who have spent a lifetime praying. And there's someone named Jesus who knows a lot about prayer because prayer was woven into his ministry and his life. There are people who are kind of power users when it comes to prayer. And so while prayer is simple and it's just talking, there are also a lot of things that we can learn about prayer. And that's what I want to do tonight, just in sort of an overview kind of way. I want us to walk alongside Jesus, this power user when it comes to prayer, and begin to learn some things from him. Because the more time that we spend with Jesus, listening to him pray, watching him pray, the more we realize that there's a whole new world available to us. There's so many aspects to prayer that perhaps we never even imagined. And Jesus' prayer life stretches us and shapes us in lots of different ways. I have written, that's what this book is about, and there's some copies out there. This book is really just walking with Jesus through his prayer life. There are a handful of occasions where the gospel authors have recorded the words Jesus actually prayed. So not just Jesus teaching on prayer, but there's some times when we have the words that Jesus actually prayed. There are about 10 of those in Scripture. And so what I do in this book is I just walk through those 10 prayers to see what they teach us about prayer. Neil was actually part of, I'm going to scoot through there we go, was actually part of a group that I do. I've got another group starting in October. And what we do is we kind of walk through those prayers together. And it's something that anybody can participate in. You don't have to be in Memphis to do it. If you have an internet connection and a phone, you can be part of that group. And what we do is we take about 6 weeks to walk through these 10 prayers of Jesus. And what Jesus does in these 10 prayers is he reveals to us 12 prayer practices that we begin to incorporate into our own life. And so I'm going to give kind of an overview of that tonight. Now, it might be a little surprising to realize that there's only about 30 references to Jesus praying or Jesus in prayer across the 4 Gospels. Obviously, Jesus prayed a lot more than 30 times. Jesus spent his whole life praying. And we can assume that Jesus would have been involved in the same kind of prayer pattern that most Jewish men would be in at that time, praying at least 3 times a day. But there are 30 times when the Gospels stop and they say, well, now here's something Jesus said about prayer. Let's pay attention to that. Here's a moment of Jesus in prayer. Let's pay attention to that. And most of the time what the Gospels are doing when they stop and they draw our attention to Jesus saying something about prayer or doing something in prayer, they're drawing our attention to that because there's something a little unusual about that. For example, when Jesus spends the whole night in prayer, well, the Gospels stop and they notice that because that's very unusual. Not everybody spends the entire night in prayer. And so we have these 30 times where the Gospel authors are basically saying, now, I want you to notice this because this is above the norm for people praying in the time of Jesus. There's something unusual taking place here, so take note of it. The Gospel of Luke is a great place to go if you want to learn more about prayer from Jesus because this was a special interest of Luke's. Luke spends a great deal of time focusing on prayer in general and focusing on Jesus in prayer in particular. One of the things that's neat about Luke's gospel, come on, one slide, there we go, is that he actually begins and ends his gospel with references to Jesus praying. So we come to Luke chapter 3, the baptism of Jesus. Now, when all the people were baptized, and when Jesus also had been baptized and was praying. And then this launches the public ministry of Jesus. So here we are at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and Luke specifically mentions that Jesus was in prayer. And then we go all the way to the end of Luke, in Luke chapter 24. Jesus is resurrected. He's now ascending to the right hand of the Father, and as he is ascending, Luke describes this scene. Then he led them out as far as Bethany, and lifting up his hands, he blessed them. While he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. Now, the word prayer is not used here, but what is a blessing? A blessing is asking God to bless these people. And that's pretty significant right there. Now, Luke's going to go on and write the book of Acts, so we get more. But as he closes his gospel, the closing scene of this movie, the last thing that we see of Jesus is Jesus looking down on his followers and shaking his head. No. The last thing we see of Jesus is Jesus ascending to the Father's right hand, looking down at his followers, and shaking his finger at them. The very last thing that Jesus does in Luke's gospel is to pray for us. It's a powerful scene. Luke begins and ends the story of Jesus with Jesus in prayer. And I think he's saying there, if you really want to understand Jesus, you have to understand his prayer. You have to understand the importance of prayer to Jesus. Because his life begins in prayer. His life ends in prayer. And maybe that's one of the most important lessons for Christians and churches to learn, is that everything begins with prayer. This church is going through some new beginnings. I have great confidence that has been wrapped in prayer. And I encourage you to continue to wrap it in prayer. The best beginnings come through prayer. And then on the other side of that, the very best endings come with prayer. We're going to look at one of those prayers that really teaches that lesson. But every time we come to the end of something significant in our life, in our church, it needs to be wrapped in prayer. Because the life of Jesus began and ended in prayer. They're the bookends around the life of Jesus. So if we're going to understand what comes in between, we've got to understand and appreciate prayer. I'm skipping slides here. I'm sorry. There we go. So if you have a Bible, let's turn over here to Luke chapter 5. Luke not only focuses on the fact that prayer started Jesus' ministry, prayer ended Jesus' ministry, but what he draws attention to here in Luke 5 is that prayer was a constant part of Jesus' ministry. Now, the language that Luke uses here is very important. Verse 15, but now even more, the report about him went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities. Because the way that's translated in our Bibles, it can sound like kind of a one-time thing. Now, let me tell you about this one time. Because there's just one time in Jesus' life when Great crowds were coming to be healed of their infirmities. But the language that Luke actually uses in that verse is language that describes something that's ongoing. This is actually a summary statement of a period in Jesus' life. Luke's saying, now, there was a season in Jesus' life when what was happening was crowds were constantly coming to Jesus. Again and again, great crowds were coming to Jesus. Over and over, these crowds were coming to Jesus again and again. People were coming to Jesus to be healed of their infirmities. This was happening every single day. Crowds were constantly coming to Jesus. And then verse 16, but he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. Now again, because the way our English Bibles translate that, it can sound like a one-time thing. Let me tell you about this time when Jesus withdrew to a desolate place and he prayed. But actually, the language Luke uses here is the same language that he uses in verse 15. It's a language of ongoing action. Luke's saying, now there was this season in the ministry of Jesus when he was always going off to that desolate place and praying. Every time he turned around, Jesus was out there praying. So this is one of those places, and Luke loves to do this, and you see this a lot in the book of Acts. One of those places where he's kind of summarizing in a few verses what was going on for a lot of the time. And it's a very interesting interplay here because you have this regular stream of crowds coming to Jesus to be healed by Jesus, people coming near to Jesus, and then Jesus leaving the crowds, and going over here and praying. This constant interplay back and forth between ministry and prayer. Ministry and prayer. Ministry and prayer. And I think one of the things that Luke is drawing our attention to is that Jesus realized you can't have one without the other. You can't have verse 15 without verse 16. And that is the great mistake of many Christians and churches today. Everybody wants verse 15. We want churches that are reaching crowds. We want crowds of people coming. And that's a good thing to want. We want to see masses of people coming to Christ to be healed of whatever their infirmities are. And as individuals, we want that. If we're followers of Jesus, we want that. We would like to see lots of people coming to us so that they might find Jesus through us. We all want verse 15. It's kind of the Christian version of the American dream. But most of the time, we try to achieve it without verse 16. Who wants to go to a desolate place and pray? Call a prayer meeting and see how many people show up. And, isn't that kind of a waste of time? There's nothing happening. But again and again, Jesus withdrew to desolate places and prayed. And perhaps if we as individuals and we as churches spent more time in verse 16, verse 15 would happen naturally. And it wouldn't take so much effort on our part. It's a powerful lesson from the life of Jesus. It's very interesting how it shows up again in chapter 6. If you jump over to chapter 6 and verse 12, Henry Nouwen, great author on prayer and the spiritual life, points out this text, chapter 6, verse 12. In these days, he, Jesus, went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And he came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of the disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea and Jerusalem and the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, who came to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those who were cured, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all the crowd sought to touch him, for power came out from him and healed them all. And now he draws attention to three movements here. He uses the image of a wheel to illustrate this. So imagine a bicycle wheel where you've got the hub and the gears right there. And then you've got the spokes radiating outward. And then you've got the rim of the wheel. And now it says, we see all three things here in this passage. First of all, we see the rim. This is where the rubber meets the road, where the action's really taking place. It's what's propelling the bike here. It's where the eye is kind of drawn to, because it's where most of the movement is taking place here. And he says that rim is 17 and following. And again, it's kind of what we all want, because what we have here in 17 and following is we've got this great crowd, this great multitude of people from all over, and they've come to hear Jesus and to be healed by Jesus, and power is coming out of Jesus, and the disciples are there, and they're all a part of that. I mean, who would not want to be part of that? That's an awesome picture. That's what we all want. It's what every church wants. It's life on that rim. But now it says you can't start with the rim. There's some other components to the wheel. So he says, think about the spokes there. The spokes are kind of what provide the structure to the wheel. And the spokes are these guys that Jesus chose to invest in and build relationships with, these 12 apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew, his brother, and James, and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon, who was called the Zealot, and Judas, the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. And now it says those are the spokes, because what Jesus decided to do was generally to do ministry with and through those 12. And from this point forward, that's what Jesus does. He does his powerful ministry with and through those 12 individuals. So you have the spokes on the wheel providing some structure and stability. But now it says you can't stop there either. You have to go all the way to the hub. And the hub is verse 12. In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. The hub is where the real power is. And on a bicycle wheel, the power flows from the hub through the spokes to the rim. Too many times Christians and churches want to focus on the rim, that ministry, or the spokes, building relationships, fellowship, but they don't really pay attention to the hub. And the hub is where you have to live. The power flows from the hub outward. That hub is prayer. And so what we see again and again in the ministry of Jesus. Is that making sense? John Nindermark has a great book called Traveling the Prayer Paths of Jesus. Jesus immersed himself in prayer when there was so much to be done and so little time to do it. Why? Time to nurture the Spirit was not and is not a secondary luxury to be attended to only after all the real work gets done. It precedes busyness and routine. The question is not whether you can afford to have such times. The question is whether you can afford not to have them. I mean, just think about how busy Jesus was. John Ortberg, in his book Soul Keeping, makes a distinction between being busy and being hurried. Busy is just kind of a fact. There are a lot of things that have to get done. Hurried is kind of a state of mind. You can be busy and not hurried. You can be hurried and not busy. Hurried really has to do with the state of your soul and the state of your heart. But Jesus was busy. There were a lot of things for Jesus to do. All these people coming to Jesus. All these people needing healing. No one in this room was more busy than Jesus. And yet again and again, Jesus made time, carved out time, prioritized time for prayer. How could he afford to do that? He's only here 3 years. Most of us have our lifetimes. And yet, even with such a short window of time, again and again, Jesus withdrew to desolate places and prayed. It could be that there's a lesson there. Well, let's keep looking, drilling down a little bit deeper in the prayer practices of Jesus. So as we skim through the Gospels, we find Jesus praying for lots of different groups of people. And this would be an interesting exercise for you to take out your prayer list. Some of you keep a written prayer list. Some of you keep it on your phone. For some of you, it's just kind of up here. But you might begin to compare your prayer list with Jesus' prayer list, because here is Jesus' prayer list. So in Mark chapter 10, people are bringing children to him, and we're told that Jesus placed his hands on them and blessed them. So what's Jesus doing there? He's praying. He's praying for the children. He's placing his hands on the children, and he's praying for them. So one of the groups that Jesus prayed for was children. Those of you who have children or grandchildren, I know you're always praying about those children. But how many other children make their way onto your prayer list? Could you say that you regularly pray for children? Of the few occasions that we have mentioned, specific occasions in the Gospels, one of them is Jesus praying for children. And what if this church became known in this community as a church that prays for children? John 11, Lazarus has died. People are grieving. It's a terribly sad situation. Jesus is weeping. And in the midst of that, Jesus stops and he prays. He prays on behalf of those who are grieving for Lazarus. That's the kind of group that often shows up on our prayer lists. We're as churches, we are great at praying for people in pain, praying for people who are grieving. Number 3, John 17, the longest prayer that we have from the lips of Jesus. He's praying for his spiritual family. He's praying for all those who would come to believe in him, for all those who would follow him, for all those churches that would flow out of all of that, John 17. You know, how many times do we pray for other churches? I'm sure this church prays for this church a lot, and that's a good thing. But in John 17, Jesus is praying for all those who would follow him, for all those churches that would flow out of that. You know, how many other churches show up on our prayer list? Number 4, Luke 22, Jesus takes Peter aside. He says, Peter, I'm praying for you. Can you imagine how disarming that must have been for Peter? For Jesus to look him in the face, I am praying for you. There are probably some Peters on most of our prayer lists, people that we're close to that yeah, we're praying for. But I wonder, how many times do you go up to them and just say, I just want you to know I continue to be in prayer for you. That's a powerful thing. One of the things I do on a fairly regular basis is pray for those who are involved in leading our Christian colleges and universities. And when I pray for them, I'll often shoot off an email to them and just say, I just want you to know I prayed for you today. I'm grateful for your ministry. And sometimes I'll have an opportunity to be sort of face-to-face with some of them. And I'm always amazed at how much that means to them, because they always mention that. They're always so grateful that someone is praying for them. I think most of us have experienced that before, when someone comes up to us and they say, I just want you to know I'm praying for you. I've been in prayer for you. Oh my goodness, that means so much. So while some of these people show up on our prayer list, maybe following Jesus' example here, take the initiative and put your hands on their shoulders and say, I am praying for you. Luke 24, Jesus prays for his followers. He's ascending to the Father's right hand. He blesses his followers. And number 6, his enemies. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So one of the few prayers that we have the words for from the lips of Jesus. And what a tough prayer. But as we look down Jesus' prayer list, we find the names of enemies. And they're not there so that Jesus can pray imprecatory prayers. Jesus, God, would you bring down fire from heaven on them? No, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. How many of you have enemies on your prayer list? The next time somebody stabs you in the back, oh yeah? I'll show you. You're going on my prayer list. It'd be a pretty powerful thing. What if the church was known primarily? What if the church's first response to people or groups in the community who seem like enemies was prayer? What if the church's first step, when something comes down in the culture from some group that's clearly opposed to our faith, what if the church's first step was to pray on behalf of those? It would be a powerful statement. And then we begin to look and see, well, when did Jesus pray? Because those are some of the people for whom Jesus prayed. When was Jesus praying? I mean, Luke says he's praying all the time, but let's begin to flesh that out. So in Mark chapter 1, after a long night of helping others, long period of doing ministry, Jesus breaks away and he prays. That makes sense. I mean, a lot of us, when we've had a really busy season of life or we've had to deal with a lot of emotional stuff, we just naturally break away and we pray. Same thing with Jesus. At his baptism, Jesus is praying, Luke chapter 3. Probably many of us experienced some kind of prayer at our baptism, but I think here the point is, at spiritually significant moments, at those milestones, those spiritual milestones in your life, that's a moment to be marked in prayer. Before making the decision to choose the 12, we just saw that. So before important decisions, prayer is called for, and for most of us, that's kind of just a natural tendency. I've got a big decision to make, I'm going to go to God in prayer. In the context of Peter's confession, Luke chapter 9, as Jesus is taught, well, who do the people say that I am? Well, who do you say that I am? You read back through that account and you find that's all in the context of Jesus at prayer. The Mount of Transfiguration, as Jesus reveals his identity to Peter and Peter, James, John. He's praying. Jesus is praying. In Matthew 26, Jesus is at a meal and he prays. He blesses the cup, blesses the bread. In the Garden of Gethsemane, as he's wrestling with the cross that stands before him, he's in prayer. On the cross, so in the midst of terrible suffering, Jesus is praying. We find Jesus praying in the morning. We find Jesus praying in the evening. When he's in the midst of healing others, interesting moment in Mark chapter 7. So not just after a period of ministry do we find Jesus praying, but in the middle of ministry, while he's healing, he's also praying. And then as he's being hurt by others, Father, forgive them. So as the pain is coming, we find Jesus in prayer. Basically, all the time. Jesus praying all the time. There was not a moment when Jesus was not praying. Could the same be said of us? Could the same be said of our churches? As I mentioned before, there are about 10 times where the gospel authors actually give us the words that Jesus prayed. And what's interesting is if you take a timeline and begin to lay down those times. Now, I'm not talking about the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer doesn't count in this what I'm talking about. I would say the Lord's Prayer is Jesus' teaching on prayer. But these other 10 occasions, what we have are we're getting to listen in. We're getting to eavesdrop as Jesus just hits his knees and prays. So all 10 of those occasions happen after Jesus' final journey toward Jerusalem. So you have all these things taking place in the life of Jesus, but there's a moment when Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem, and everything from that point forward is colored by the cross, colored by Jerusalem, colored by the suffering of the cross. And so it's very interesting that the gospel authors only recorded prayers that came from the lips of Jesus that occurred after Jesus moved into this period of suffering. So these are the 10 prayers, Matthew chapter 11, 25 through 26. We have Jesus thanking God in the midst of a period of great disappointment. It's really an amazing prayer. John 11, Lazarus' death, and Jesus thanking God that God hears them in the midst of that hurt. John 12 and part of John 17, Jesus says, you know what? In the midst of this suffering, I could be saying, God, help me. But here's what I'm going to pray. God, glorify yourself through me. Show yourself through my suffering. John 17, this long prayer as Jesus intercedes for his disciples and his church. Matthew 26, God, I don't want to drink this cup. Nevertheless, your will be done. Luke 23, Father, forgive them. Mark 15, why have you forsaken me? John 19, I thirst. We're probably going to run out of time, but I would argue that's actually a prayer from the lips of Jesus. I thirst. Luke 23, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then John 19, it is finished. It is finished. Again and again, I would argue that's a prayer from the lips of Jesus. All of those prayers, if you laid them out on a timeline, all come after Luke 9:51, where Luke says, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. So basically what the gospel authors have done for us is they've decided to record only those prayers that Jesus prayed in the midst of pain. The prayers that Jesus prayed from the pit of suffering. Why? Well, there may be a lot of reasons, but one of the main reasons, I think, is that pain's a part of life. Every person endures pain and suffering of lots of different kinds. And one of the most difficult things to know is how to pray in the midst of pain. It's hard for churches to know how to pray in pain. It's hard for people to know how to pray in pain. We don't know what we should say to God, if it's okay to say certain things to God when we're hurting. We don't know if He's listening. It's hard. It's hard to pray when you're hurting. And so I think that's why the gospel authors decided to hone in on these prayers. Here's Jesus in pain, Jesus entering suffering, and let's listen in to the way that He prays. And so what we get are these 10 amazing, remarkable, powerful prayers from the lips of Jesus. I'm trying to make a decision in my head here because I know we're running out of time. I'm talking to myself in my head, although I'm not talking to you. All right, maybe a couple of these here. So some of these are familiar to you, so we can do them fairly quickly. The garden prayer, the Garden of Gethsemane. Let this cup pass, your will be done. This prayer is prayed in the midst of intense turmoil in Jesus' own heart as He faces the cross. And notice what Jesus models here for us. Two almost opposing ways of praying. On the one hand, let this cup pass. Let this cup pass. When you think about that prayer, it's amazing that Jesus would say that. Jesus has spent all eternity preparing for this moment, preparing for the cross. And now it arrives, and Jesus says, I'd really rather not. This is really not what I want to do. I really, now that it's here, it doesn't seem like such a good idea. I'd really rather not. Let this cup pass. And what Jesus is teaching us in that prayer is that it's not only okay, it is expected. It is a mark of spiritual maturity for you to be able to say to God, I don't like this, God. I do not like this. I don't want this. I don't want to move. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want that relationship to end. God, I don't want to go through cancer treatment. God, I don't want these money troubles. I don't. One of the most important lessons that Jesus teaches us about prayer is that it's okay to be honest with God. You don't have to pretty that stuff up. Jesus did not. I mean, I know it sounds kind of pretty in our Bibles. Let this cup pass. But I'm sure it came out a lot harsher than that, a lot more raw than that. It's okay for you to be honest with God. Say, God, I don't like this at all. Not one little bit. There's nothing about this that I like. And if you could find any way around it, I'm asking you to find it. It's not only okay to say that, it's a mark of spiritual maturity to say that. And I'm afraid too many times we get the thought that we can't pray that way. It's not allowed. It is allowed. Jesus wants us to learn how to pray that way. Let this cup pass. There is another side to it. And it's really the only way to keep any sanity in the midst of pain and suffering. Because God does want us to be honest in our prayers and to say, God, I don't want this. Let this cup pass. But that doesn't mean He's always going to answer that prayer with a yes. Did God answer Jesus' prayer with a yes here? Let this cup pass? Did He get a yes? No. God answered that prayer with a no. Not even Jesus could get a yes every time. And if Jesus can't get a yes every time, we're not going to get a yes every time. So when the no comes, the only real way to keep any sanity is to learn how to say, your will be done. I believe, even though I cannot see it, and I'm not sure I fully understand it, I believe, God, that your way is the best way. Even though I don't really want it, I still believe it. So your will be done. If we can learn how to pray both of those in the same moment of pain with authenticity, it would revolutionize our prayer lives. This painful honesty and yet this total surrender to the will of God. All right, we'll close with this one because it's just kind of interesting. So you have this statement, I thirst. This statement from the cross, I thirst. We could just kind of label that as, well, he's thirsty. It's just a request. But perhaps this is a prayer. There are a lot of authors that think this is a prayer. I do tend to think it's a prayer. And I think what Jesus is modeling for us here. So here's Jesus. He's on the cross. He's in the worst moment of pain possible. And what he prays for is something so fundamental, so simple, so seemingly small. Just a drink, something to drink. I'm thirsty. God, I'm so helpless at this moment. I can't even provide the basic necessities of my body. God, I thirst. I thirst. And what I really like about that is that it reminds us that it's okay to pray about the little things. Sometimes we tend to think that prayer should be reserved for those grand, lofty, big kingdom things out there of saving the world and uniting the church and ending poverty. And yes, we should pray about those things. And Jesus prayed about those things, and He teaches us to pray, your will be done, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's big stuff right there. That's major, majestic, magnificent stuff right there. But what Jesus models on the cross is, it's also okay to pray about the little things. It's okay to pray about that test that's coming up. It's okay to pray about that negative coworker. And God, could I just have one day without criticism from that coworker? It's not only okay to pray about the little things, it's expected. It's a mark of spiritual maturity to lift up everything in your life in prayer to God, because God wants to hear it all. He wants to hear it all, because it all goes back to relationship. It's all really just a father and a child learning how to love one another. So there's lots more there, but we're basically out of time. What I want to encourage you to do is you might just take that Gospel of Luke, because there's so much of this that comes out in Luke's Gospel, and just begin to read it on your own and look for those moments when Jesus is in prayer and just ask God, what are you teaching me about prayer through that? Because again, Jesus is a power user when it comes to prayer. And while prayer is simple, Jesus has so much to teach us about prayer. Let me close by praying.